half hour. I'm so delighted to see all of you this morning or this afternoon at the inaugural Afternoons with the Athenaeum here virtually. I'm Beth Hessel, the Executive Director. We have Tess Galen running all of the technology, and Jill Lee, our librarian, who will be sharing in this conversation with me today. Our goal with these new Afternoons with the Athenaeum is to provide you a short little lunch break, a nice half hour, and we'll keep it to those half hours to learn a little bit more about interesting items that we have in the Athenaeum collection, whether it be our library collection, our archives, or our museum collection. And it's a chance to talk with staff about it. We'll always provide a little bit of information and then open it up. Our goal is to talk for about 15 minutes and then open up the last 15 minutes to questions and conversation with all of you. So hopefully this will be a good, interesting time. I suspect there may be some among you who may have more knowledge about Harriet Beecher Stowe or Uncle Tom's Cabin or things related to that you want to share also. So we're so delighted you're here and joining us for this half hour. When we were talking among the staff about what sorts of things we might do this programming on, we talked about the fact that our one of our copies of Uncle Tom's Cabin, not the initial 1852 version, but the version that was published in 1853 in London, is being lent in about a month to the International Museum of the Reformation in Geneva for an exhibit that they have coming up opening in end of October through February about Calvin in America, looking at the Protestant experience in the United States in the 400 years since the Mayflower landed at Plymouth Rock. And this book is an important touchstone, and as we understand the anti-slavery movement in the United States. I'm actually the American curator for that exhibit. So it was fun to actually have an item from the Athenaeum that we could loan for the exhibit, even though we can't go over there and see it ourselves. So we thought it would be fun to talk about the various material. And Jill, after I give you a little background to Uncle Tom's Cabin, Jill will be able to share with you the wealth of material that we found in our library related to Uncle Tom's Cabin. So it's really just a fun collection that we have here. I'm curious, raise your hand for those of you who, or send up a little happy face on your reactions if you have read Uncle Tom's Cabin at some time in your life. A lot of people we don't have video for, but we're seeing some thumbs up, hands raised. A lot of us have read it at one time or another. If not, we've heard about it. I'm curious, has anybody seen the play? Did you, perhaps as children, see the Uncle Tom's Cabin play? Nobody, not really seen anybody there for that. Uncle Tom's Cabin was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, who came from an illustrious family of preachers and reformers. Her father, Lyman Beecher, in his time, was considered the best preacher in the United States. He was a Presbyterian pastor who was eventually put on trial by the Presbyterian Church for heresy because he challenged some of the very strict Calvinist beliefs of the Presbyterian Church at that time. Basically, the idea of the total depravity of humans, that we are born to original sin, as Augustine said, and we are totally depraved and destined for hell unless God has predestined or pre-chosen us for heaven. And he challenged this. He went on to serve both Presbyterian though and congregational churches in Connecticut, and eventually went to Ohio to serve as the president of Lane Theological Seminary. With his first wife, he had 5 or 6 children, and then 4 more with his second wife, and many of them went on to become reformers. His eldest daughter, Catherine, was a reformer in women's education, starting seminaries for young women to learn, and her belief that women needed to be well educated in order to be proper helpmeets to their husbands, to teach their children and help direct their husbands on the moral path. her brothers, Harriet's brothers, among them, were famous preachers like Henry Ward Beecher, who was, for his time also, one of the lead reformers in what came to be known as the Second Great Awakening. And he was known for leading the Gospel of Love movement, which really talked about God as relational and a friend instead of this stern judge. So he's very famous in Boston. He eventually was tried in a sensational scandal for having an affair with a married member of his church. So this family was well known for reform movements. They took on temperance, they took on education, they challenged these very strict Puritan ideas of who God was. All of this really shaped Harriet Beecher in her upbringing. And as we see, if you can remember from having read Uncle Tom's Cabin, she really embraced this idea of God as a friend and the idea of having a relationship with God. She was very into visions and believed in angels, and she believed strongly, instead of this idea that we're born into sin, this idea of children as the epitome of innocence and purity and simplicity. And you can see that if you think of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and one of the central figures was Eva St. Clair, this young white child whose father was a slaveholder in Louisiana, who helped bring her father to repentance and really helped regenerate a lot of individuals through her purity before she had a tragic death. Harriet and her family opposed slavery. And by the way, so she ended up marrying in 1836. She was born in 1811, seventh of 9 children. She married Calvin Stowe, who was a Greek teacher, when Harriet's father became president of Lane Seminary, invited Calvin, knew about him and his young wife, and invited them to come and him to teach at Lane Seminary. After his wife died at the age of 26, and she had been one of Harriet's best friends, Calvin and Harriet ended up getting married. And Calvin, we might say now he may have been a schizophrenic or something like that. He kept having visions his whole life from the time that he was a young child. And he would talk to them, whether they be elves or angels or demons, and he would have these conversations with these people. But she really embraced her husband's visions and had a lot of visions herself. They were all involved in or supported anti-slavery. They weren't really strong supporters of folks like Garrison, who believed that that the church was hypocritical and an unworthy institution because it upheld so much of slavery and didn't really take a strong stand against slavery, and questioned the validity of the Constitution for not disavowing and for allowing slavery. They took a more moderate approach. But Harriet found herself being pushed toward a more radical view about slavery as time went on. Various things happened. Her family had servants. Some were white, some were black. And as she heard the stories of her African-American servants, one woman who had experienced sexual assault as a slave in the South before she managed to find freedom in the North. And you see this play out in Uncle Tom's Cabin, these stories. She was involved and friends with various people who were part of the Underground Railroad, and she would learn stories from them of what these men and women and children went through under slavery, and then found their way north into freedom. And then the fugitive slave law really pushed her over the edge. In 1850, the fugitive slave law passed by Congress, by Webster and Clay, as a means they thought to kind of help ease the rift that was growing between North and South, really codified what was already in the Constitution. And it said that anybody in the North who assists someone who was running away from slavery would face a $1,000 fine and up to 6 months in prison. So what it did was put Northerners in this untenable position of having to support the institution of slavery. Instead of helping people who found their way to freedom in the North remain free, they were required under federal law to help return these individuals to slavery. And this so outraged Harriet that it pushed her finally to write this story, Uncle Tom's Cabin. She had published a lot before that. Her husband didn't make a lot of money, and her work as a writer helped create a little extra for her family. And so she wrote this. She first published it over a 10-month period in a anti-slavery publication, The National Era, which was published by an abolitionist, Gamaliel Bailey. So it appeared in 10 segments between June 1851 and March 1852. And it was very popular in those segments, so that she was able to get a contract for $30,000 to publish it in the United States. Now, it was that was a very big advance that she received. She received 10,000 advance and then 30,000. But her book was so popular, it was published on March 20th, 1852. Its first printing of 5,000 copies sold out in just a few days. And by the end of the month, the second printing had also sold out. This book, which is really interesting, the first printing was available in 3 formats. One was a paper-covered edition that was available for $1. There was a cloth edition for $1.50, or a full gilt version for $2. And these were all in 2 volumes. And if you look here at this picture, you will see the lower right, the top one. You'll see volume 1, that first picture up there. We have the originals that Jill will talk about. It was a 2-volume. When you think about these prices, they're equivalent to $24 to $48 today. So these books were going for, a paperback version was going for about what you would pay for a hardcover book today. And it was, a lot of money for the average person to buy. But it was so popular, it kept selling out. And quickly, it was also printed in Europe, in England, and it sold even more copies in England. Unfortunately, there were no copyrights at that point in time. And Jill's holding up, if you can see, Jill has the English copy that we have. There were no copyrights, so she didn't receive any money for these publications. It was translated into French and German. Interestingly, because her book was grounded, her book was written not to convince the general public that slavery was wrong, but to address other Christians that slavery was wrong. And so it is infused with her Christian values and theology. She creates both Uncle Tom and the little girl Eva St. Clair are 2 critical characters who are almost Christ-like in both their personalities and their ability to, in the way that they just gave selflessly to others, and in their cruel and awful deaths and suffering. So it's a very Christian work, and she portrays, she was really the first white author to write a novel that portrayed African Americans as human, as fully, as intelligent, and morally capable as whites. In fact, she portrays the African Americans as more spiritually capable than white Northerners or Southerners, which is a fascinating twist and shift. Now, her book was so popular. What happened was that not only did her book become the bestseller, that it took years for any other book to become as bestseller as Uncle Tom's Cabin, but it also led to an increase in sales of Bibles. Many families talked about using it as a sort of children's Bible for their children, but then also buying Bibles for their home to go along with Uncle Tom's Cabin. Very quickly, a couple of playwrights made plays out of this. George Akins was the most popular, and the plays made her book available to a much wider audience, to people, working class people who might not normally buy a book and read it or couldn't afford to buy the book, would go and see these plays. It was the first play that was to be presented as a play in and of itself. At that time, you didn't go to the theater and see one play. You saw a play with a series of other vignettes or whatever around it. It was a play in and of itself. And it was viewed also as a play that was really creating theater as something that was seen as more respectable for the middle class, because it was dealing with moral subjects. So these books just had an amazing impact on culture. The books helped affect politics. As you saw, the dying of the Whig Party and the rise of the Republican Party. A lot of the instigators who started the Republican Party were in conversations with Harriet Beecher Stowe and read this book and found it as a moral clarion call to move more towards, really take a strong stand politically against slavery. It also had a huge backlash in the South, as Southerners were quick to say that she was making this all up. It had nothing to do with reality, and try to uphold slavery as a moral burden that white Southerners had to bear as a way to bring up African Americans. So there was this real backlash in the South. So it was just this amazing book, and Tess has some pictures too. One of the things that it did also, as we know now, anytime a movie comes out or a popular book or a comic, there are merchandise tie-ins. You can get your Happy Meal that has all the little figurines that go with whatever kids movie has come out. Uncle Tom's Cabin reflected really that first effort at successful effort at merchandise tie-ins. There were tons of what they called Uncle Tomitudes that were created, whether they be teapots or little images or plates, dolls. You'll see these here. The bottom picture actually reminds me of dolls that I remember even seeing when I was a little girl, and some of you may remember dolls that had a little white doll on one side and a little black doll on the other side. They were usually made of cloth, and you turn the skirts over from one side to the other. And one of them on one side was little Eva St. Clair. The other side was, I'm blanking on her name, the woman in the book, of course, who fled across the ice to save herself and her child from slavery. So they became just very popular. People wanted to buy items related to it. So she was seen as being able to integrate reform issues. Temperance was a huge issue in Uncle Tom's Cabin, really showing the evils of drink. Slavery was a huge issue. Prostitution, which she linked to slavery, and the way that women's bodies were abused and assaulted in slavery. She even combined into it issues of the way that white labor was degraded through this capitalist slavery system. And so taking on those issues of white labor in the North in particular that were implicated in the slave in the slave system through the production and manufacture of goods that came from the raw material produced in the South. And so she tied those two issues together, which not very many people at that time were taking seriously, that there was a link between what was happening to white workers and how white labor was being treated, and how African Americans were being treated in slavery. So she managed to take all of these issues into popular fiction, and she didn't make any of it sensational. When she talked about, when she alluded to the assault of female bodies in slavery, she didn't do it in a sensational manner, as most writers at that time were doing, but rather saw it as a case of moral uplift and really made this popular fiction about really difficult issues something that was palatable to middle class values. Now, what's interesting is that she, before she published this, she'd written 3 anti-slavery short stories that had been published. And and then she wrote this book, which really was trying to help people morally shift their minds. By 1856, she had reached a breaking point. There had been the murder of Elijah Lovejoy, who was a white publisher in Kansas, who had been murdered for his abolitionist beliefs, and he had been a friend of the family's. There had been another number of other issues that had really just drove her to the breaking point and said, you know, this isn't good. And she finally wrote a book in 1856 called Dred, which was, of course, just a precursor to Dred. The Dred Scott decision had not been made yet by the Supreme Court. Dred was supposed to be this young man who was the son of what's his name, the major slave insurrection person. I'm sorry, it's lunch. I'm forgetting things here. But it began to advocate violence in order to break down the slavery system. So she did make this move. In Uncle Tom's Cabin, she's not advocating violence. She's quite the opposite. But by 1856, she has gotten to that point where she believes that violence may be okay if necessary in order to end slavery. So these books have been very influential. They've continued to be influential throughout our history since they were written, but in that particular time and place, they were incredibly influential. Jill's going to show you a few books, and one of them that she published right after Uncle Tom's Cabin is The Key. And in it is really a primary document source in which she includes all sorts of documents, whether they're slave narratives, personal testimony, things that were printed in newspapers that really show the basis for what she was writing in the book, to say this wasn't just fiction that I made up in my head. Which interestingly, she also shared with some friends after she wrote it that she says, I didn't write this book, God wrote this book. She had been at a church service, and during communion, she had this vision come to her of some scenes, and she went home and wrote them down and then proceeded to write the book. So she really believed that God gave her the visions that she then put into the book. So the key is the primary documents that she used to ground all of the stories and the characters. So they weren't just, she wasn't sensationalizing and making up, but they were really based on real facts about slavery. So I'm going to turn this over to Jill, share a little bit.
Okay. I just want to show folks an overview of what's in our collection and remind you that you are permitted to view any of these. We would just ask that you make an appointment before coming in to see them. We are having limited research appointments now, but if you want to see any of these items in person, please make an appointment with Bruce Laverty. So, and Tess is going to show you closer up on the screen. Our first one that she has up is our earliest U.S. edition of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is the 1853. As Beth said, it was published in 1852, but our earliest U.S. copy is 1853. And I think you can see on the title page, it already says 263,000. So it's already been very popular. It is a 2-volume set. And you can see, if you can look at the one I'm showing, it is very well worn. So it is not a pristine copy that was just sitting on a shelf somewhere. It is a book that has been read. So our earliest edition is actually the British one, which is an 1852 edition. The interesting thing also about the British edition is that the subtitle has changed. In the American edition, it was Life Among the Lowly, and now it's the story of a Christian slave, really emphasizing the religious aspect. So this 1852 London edition is the one that, as Beth said, is going to be on exhibit. And this one is illustrated. So we did not get this at the time. It was a gift from our member, Dr. Koblenzer, at a later date. So, and
as you can see from those pictures, as Jill shows them, this was a real shift also in even how African Americans were portrayed visually. instead of doing a minstrel kind of visual presentation, which was very typical for that time, the illustrators even took care to try to illustrate the characters in the novel as full humans with full respect and dignity, which was a real shift.
And as Beth mentioned, we do have the key, which is the author's basically backup to say, I wasn't making this up, because especially Southerners accused her of really blowing things out of proportion because it was a novel. So she published a backup to show, no, these things were really happening. Unfortunately, we also have the other side of the coin in that we have notes on Uncle Tom's Cabin. And this is a more pro-slavery view at the time. You see, it's a logical answer. And this is not supporting Harriet Beecher Stowe. This is taking the opposite viewpoint. We did notice for our copy here that it was a gift of the author at the time. So I don't know if you can see on the screen, the Reverend Stearns did give us our copy. He was not a member here, so we're not sure if he was giving copies to many libraries to try to promote his viewpoint, or how he decided to give us a copy, but it is a gift of the author.
All I've been able to find out about him is that he was an Episcopal minister in, or be the Church of England at that time still, in Maryland. He also was a teacher, I think, of Greek or some other issues at a college there. But he had a number of sermons in which he was really taking the North to task for what he saw as their hypocrisy. And he believed that slavery was a good thing. So it's really interesting, you know, it helps as a reminder that Maryland was still the Upper South. And there was strong support. People were being imprisoned in Maryland for having copies of Uncle Tom's Cabin.
So we do have some reviews from the time period in our collection. I brought up one from the Southern Quarterly Review. All I will say is it's very tough reading, because the author is not saying that slavery is a necessary evil. They're pretty much saying that slavery is a good thing all around. It's a very lengthy review against Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it's really hard to take for a modern reader. We also have how Uncle Tom's Cabin was received in London. So it's a little Uncle Tom in England. So it's the London Times review of Uncle Tom's Cabin from 1852. So we actually have older British items than we do American items. I'm trying to keep us to time, so sorry we're a minute over, but it's also interesting that we have a biography of Harriet Beecher Stowe, but her name is not in the title because she was so closely associated with it. It's the life work of the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Her name is not there. It's not on the cover. It's not on the title page. She is the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. So that's a quick review, and now we'll get to the questions because we have gone a little longer.
Yes.
So if anyone has any
Apology.
questions? Sorry, I tried to do that quickly, but again, all of these are available to view in person by appointment.
So Tess, you want to take down the shared screen and then we can see everybody, and anybody has any questions or things you want to know a little more about what we have in our collection or about?
There is one question in the chat. I'm not sure you know the answer though.
I don't see any question in the chat.
Came privately to me. I will read it for you. The question is, with no prior publishing success, how was Harriet able to get such a large advance for a first book? Did she have an agent?
So that's a great question. She had a long history of publishing. She had written a few books, and she had published regularly in magazines. So she had been publishing for probably about 20 years. She was in her 50s, at the 40s, late 40s, when this book came out. She had been publishing for at least 20 years by this time. So she was a known entity. And the book was originally published as serialized, which was a pretty usual way of books starting. So it was serialized in the national era. And it was so well received there in the national era that was what led her to get the great advance. The publisher really knew that this book was going to be a hit. Based on already her reputation. She had not written any books dealing with slavery, just a few short stories prior to this, but most of her books dealt with moral issues, religious issues. Some dealt with issues of, sort of alternative religious things like necromancy or whatever. So she had a good reputation, and on the strength of that serialized, she was able to get the contract for her book. Smart publishers, because I'm sure they made a whole lot more money than she did. So we have a couple more questions here. So it was, how was Uncle Tom's Cabin received among free Blacks in the North? It was also well received. So you had leaders like Frederick Douglass, who were really spoke strongly and favorably. There were a number of other men who were believed to potentially have been their stories, their narratives, or stories to have played a part in shaping who the Uncle Tom character. And most of them were quick to trumpet that, to claim that they themselves were the soul. She really took an amalgamation to create each character, but would say, hey, it was me. And so a lot of pride in that, which I think is important for us, because as you know, especially in the 1950s and 60s with the civil rights movement, Uncle Tom became a pejorative term as somebody who would just roll over to the white man and the white system and give them what they needed. But at that point, she had created the character Uncle Tom as the epitome of what a man could and should be. And I was saying particularly like what a Christian man could and should be. He was someone who did right, who made the decision when he had a chance to kill some white enslavers. He did not, because it was not the right, he believed killing would hurt him more. As a Christian, it was the wrong thing for him to do. Who would make a vow and keep his vow. He was seen as someone who suffered and endured. And who didn't cave in that suffering, but who continued to live with his morals and his strong beliefs. That he was really, if we think about Martin Luther King and those others who believed in passive resistance, he was more along that line. So although the term Uncle Tom now has a negative sense, he was really portrayed as the best that any man of any race could be, in who he was as a person of integrity and strength and resolve and values. So the book was really received really well. The fact that it did take a strong stand about the abuse of women under slavery, that it positively portrayed African Americans when they had not been positively portrayed by white authors before, was really huge. That it created this sense of moral indignation in those who read it. And really helped shift the sense. So it was positively received. So here's a question for Jill. Do you know if we have any materials on the Underground Railroad at the Athenaeum? You're muted.
Here we go. Okay, yes, we have a handful of things in the circulating collection. The oldest item that we have is from 1872. It's by William Still, and it is the Underground Railroad, a record of facts, authentic narratives, letters, etc., narrating the hardships, hairbreadth escapes, and death struggles of the slaves in their efforts for freedom, as related by themselves and others or witnessed by the author. So
and that's an important, William Still was he's an African-American activist who was one of the leaders in the Underground Railroad movement. And one of the things the most important thing that he did was to collect those narratives and stories of African-Americans who successfully escaped slavery and record them. So his work is one of the best sources that historians and scholars today have to reconstruct the Underground Railroad. So that's a very important work that we have. So any reviews by Philadelphians?
It's 780 pages. I just wanted to say it is not a small work. It also has 24 leaves of plates. So it is a major work.
Reviews by Philadelphians. So the fun thing for us is that at this point in time, the primary resources that we had at the Athenaeum were newspapers and periodicals. So the Bush Room, if you come in where we have our lectures now, was floor to ceiling. The walls were designed to hold newspapers and periodicals. And we had something like 52 or so that came in every week, all over the world, from Philadelphia, from every religious denomination you could think of. So we had quite a lot then. We do not have those archives anymore. So we do not have local publications on local reviews. Jill and I were trying to see if we could find any online before our meeting, and didn't really locate anything. Of course, other publishers tried to capitalize on the success of Uncle Tom's Cabin. As I said before, without copyright law, anybody could republish overseas. So we didn't have an international copyright protection. So in the U.S., you had protection for her, but overseas, it was published widely in different languages and in Europe, and it sold even more copies. So she didn't get any royalties for all the books that sold overseas. And she wrote a play, a one-woman play for Uncle Tom's Cabin that was only presented a few times, and it was actually it was written for and performed by a Philadelphian woman whose mother had been a fugitive slave. And it got a few performances here in Philadelphia and a few in New York, but it didn't go any further than that. But there was Grant Aiken and one other person, I'm forgetting who it was, who both wrote plays that were very popular. So they were able to publish those plays. The Aiken play was much closer, hewed much more closely to the lines of Stowe's work, and was much more respectful of the humanity and dignity of African Americans. The other one played much more into the minstrelry, which was very popular at the time. But Aiken's was the much more popular play. So Uncle Tom's Cabin, the fugitive slave law was one of those drivers for her in writing this. The experiences of African Americans that she knew, including visiting in the South and visiting a plantation in the South and speaking to the slaves there, speaking to African Americans who worked for her family and their experiences and their family's experiences, the experiences of fugitive slaves that she learned from individuals that she knew through her larger network. Now, the interesting thing is Stowe made a lot of money off of this, but she used it to help further anti-slavery causes. She used it to help fund education for African Americans as they came to the North and were freed. She used it. There were two young women who had escaped, and the fugitive, the slave catchers were coming after them. Her brother, Henry Ward Beecher, held an auction at his church in Boston for the church people to put money in the pews to raise the money to buy the freedom of these young women. And then they went up and lived with Harriet and her husband for a time. while she kept them safe and then paid for them to go to college and receive an education. So she really invested the money where her values were. She didn't just use it to have a really fancy lifestyle. Although her husband fretted because she was much more successful than he was, but her money was not used for a lavish lifestyle. It was used to go where her values were and help support African Americans in the fight for freedom. She's really a fascinating person. There are two great books. I don't know if we have these in our collection, but David Reynolds has a book called Mightier Than the Sword, and its subtitle is Uncle Tom's Cabin and the Battle for America. It's hard with these cameras to figure out how to get it right. This is a great book that talks about the book and how it was received over time. Probably the best biography. You can get that older biography that's written about the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin that we have here in our collection. But Joan Hedrick, back in 1994, published probably what is the best biography on Harriet Beecher Stowe. So it'd be Joan Hedrick, Hedrick. It's a nice thick one. So there are lots of great works to learn more about her and her family and their engagement in all of those 19th century reform movements, not least of which would be slavery and abolition. It's really a fascinating time. Jill, for you, does the Athenaeum have other books relating to the whole Christian anti-slavery movement in America in the 19th century? You're muted.
I do not know offhand. I would have to do a search on that. Don't know off the top of my head.
There are a bunch on my shelves in my office that are mine, if you want to browse. And if you want some suggestions, I'd be happy to give them to you. One of the bonuses, of course, that we have if you're a shareholder of the Athenaeum is that you can also check books out of the University of Pennsylvania. So what we don't have, more than likely UPenn will have, and that also provides you more opportunities to expand that reading if you want to read more. Excuse me. I will put out a little plug here to carry this time period forward in the continuing struggle. Tess can give us the exact date, but we have Pineal Joseph is going to be speaking on his new book. Is it later this month or October? The Sword and the Shield, about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. And so if you haven't heard him speak on NPR or elsewhere, he's a fabulous speaker. It's a fabulous book. And so this is a great way to bring this whole conversation about civil rights and inequality and equality in the United States forward. So I encourage you all to attend that. Fanny Kemble, oh, she's another great. And Tess just put up the link to that one.
That's October 1st.
October 1st. And the book is in the library. It's a great, I'm sorry, this camera stuff is crazy. Pineal Joseph. So I don't know if we have Fanny Kemble related. Do we have her journals or anything? Jill? Fanny Kemble.
I'm putting up a link to the catalog where anyone can search. You do not need to log into the catalog to be able to search it. So that way you can see everything. Because I'm not sure by the nature of the questions if you're looking for something that you can borrow or you're looking for research level materials. It's the same thing with the Underground Railroad. We have things that you could borrow and things that you may use here. So,
and if you, Fanny Kemble, of course, is she was an English actress singer who married an American Southerner and proceeded to live on the plantation for a while and was pretty appalled by slavery. So,
and
if everybody got that link, if you need it, you can also find it on our website, philathenaeum.org. If you go to the little collections tab and search down pull down, you'll see our catalog. So you can search the Franklin Library, which includes UPenn, but all of our works are also integrated there. If you want to know what the Athenaeum has in particular, you can specialize that search when you're in Franklin to look just for items that are at the Athenaeum.
I also will put in the chat the link to our next one of these events, our next afternoon one, which will be with Bruce Laverty, our curator, about before the Athenaeum was at our current building. So a little bit about those like 30 or 40 years or so before we were in our current building. So that will be on October 13th at noon, so if you want to come to that too.
So we thank you all for joining. I hope you enjoyed it. If you go ahead and send us, you can send, if you have thoughts or comments or anything, go ahead and email me or Tess, and we're always happy to get your feedback, and so glad you joined us. Look forward to seeing you at more programs, and I hope it's nice. You can just sit in your own home and do this, but we're looking forward to the time when we can have you all back here in person too. Jack, everybody have a great rest of your afternoon.